come to realize by finding communities like this, like Venture Café Tokyo, that there really is a robust and respected venture community.
And it's just a different culture. After the international one, everybody stays, just talks, have drinks. After the Japanese one, half leaves right away. No questions, nothing. It's improving, so we're trying to make this trick where we create two separate communities.
Welcome to our, what month is it? January 2025 event for Robotics Tokyo. I'm Mike Sudano. We are doing is having a panel about building a robotics community in Japan. And I've invited a number of friends who are leaders of communities in Japan.
Hi everybody, I'm Ilya, an entrepreneur based here in Tokyo. A little bit about myself, what I'm doing. I've started and failed two startups, mainly fintechs, one in Singapore, one in New York and Singapore. One bootstrapped, one raised decent amount of capital. Experience mainly on the engineering side, machine learning and AI. And for the past year, since I came back to Japan, I used to live here for 2 years and then moved out to build a startup in Singapore. But for the past year, I've been, as a hobby, I've been building an AI community. We started with around 40 people 13 months ago, and now it's around 2,000 people. It's a pretty cool community. Why I started it? Because I haven't found anything happening here a year ago when I came back. So I decided to try and emerge some of the AI talent that Tokyo has, because I believe Tokyo has a huge potential to become an AI hub.
Hi, I'm Nico. So I actually help out Mike a bit with Robotics Tokyo, with organizing and finding people for our panels and for our community. Robots for Space to do what's called on-orbit services.
Hey everybody, my name is Ryusuke. I'm the Executive Director of Venture Café Tokyo. And actually, I'm one of the founding members of CIC Venture Café. For Venture Café, actually, many those innovators, entrepreneurs come around. Some of them are actually wanting to start startups, and some of them are just wanting to start non-profit or things like that. But regardless what they do, I'm always try to support everybody. So yeah, I hope I can contribute to this panel session and then maybe to activities of each of you. So yeah, thank you. Looking forward to it.
My name is Kaori Ray, a founder of podcast to interview founders and also people who support the startup ecosystem. If you are a visionary founder or who want to be an investor or want to join accelerator, you are in the right place. Thank you so much for coming. Anyway, let's get started. 行きましょう. Okay, the first question. So, here, there are 4 amazing community builders, community managers, people in Tokyo actually, right? Robotics, AI salon, and same robotics and space. And also, Venture Café Tokyo has 7 years history, right? Amazing. It's difficult. We could start community easily, but same as startup, it's not short sprint. We have to do marathon, right? And then you guys do every month events. It's amazing. So, okay, first question. What is the current stage and venture and startup within Tokyo? Yeah, and especially robotics and AI. Tell us about your opinion.
So, I came here about 3 or 4 years ago, and even then, as recent as then, I felt like the startup community sort of had a bad rap within Japan because generally you were expected to become a sarari person, and work for a large company and work many hours and stay there for many years. And as many of you know, in Silicon Valley, generally you work for a company for 2 or 3 years. You find some place that maybe has a better salary and benefits. You get fed up with where you're working, and then you're kind of expected to leave and move on to greener pastures, and this happens every couple of years. But in Japan, I never got the feeling that that was the same way. Initially, you would just be a worker there for life. and that has definitely changed. Either it's changed out from under me, or I've just come to realize by finding communities like this, like Venture Café Tokyo, that there really is a robust and respected venture community. So that's my opinion, that now it is, looked highly upon.
So when we started our Venture Cafe activity back in 2018, so it's 7-year history that we have. But it was like very interesting experience, particularly on the first night. So we are essentially bringing this like American innovation culture as we were born in North America, right? Venture Cafe. And then the first night we hosted this kind of a social gathering, but the landscape that we observed was completely different from now. People just wearing like black suits just showed up. They just kind of started exchanging business cards to each other, and then no networking or no fruitful conversation happened. But as you say, if you look at right now, Tokyo Thursday gathering everywhere, really like this fruitful conversation involving all those like global talents, happening. So completely, yeah, I'm pretty sure like there's been a huge leap, from the 7 years before.
Did you have beer at that event, that first one?
What say?
Did you have beer at the first one?
Yes, of course.
Okay,
And
all
but
right.
people thought of it as weird, because like we were kind of giving away the beers for free, just like today, and then everybody just questioned us, hey, how do you do that? Why do you do that? So.
Where are you getting your beer money?
Yeah, exactly. People felt a little bit suspicious about Venture Cafe, but.
Yeah, so I guess, I've been here now 7 years, so I guess I arrived when you guys were just starting Venture Cafe. And being on the other end, being on the working side of startups, having my whole career in startups, and most of it here in Japan, actually, it's interesting. You talk about being a salaryman. Some of these startups actually expect you to be a salaryman. They're a startup in the sense that they're venture-driven, they've got innovative new technology, but the way they were working was still very, for lack of better words, Japanese. And so they weren't getting that like Silicon Valley kind of feel, or that North American or European startup feel. It had its own flavor here. And the first two startups I worked at, they both, in a sense, failed. Not necessarily failed, but they ran out of funding, right? So one of the challenges for sure is finding the right fit for whatever it is you're providing as AI or a robotics company. And I think that's one of the big challenges for any startup. And when you look at some of my past work, we always come up on Telexistence, which right now is looking like, they could be one of the next unicorns for Japan. They're doing very interesting things. And the main thing that I would say about robotic startups in terms of reputation in Japan is this work culture. So how do we shift into this mindset where we're building a community, not just this community, but your workplace is also part of that community. And even now as we speak, we don't see companies engaging in our community, right? We're seeing individuals from companies, but not the company itself engaging and saying, hey, we want to be part of Robotics Tokyo, we want to be part of Tokyo AI. So I think that's one of the big challenges for our community here, is how do we get the companies engaged, not just individuals?
That actually resonates a lot, because I'm looking to partner with one or two larger companies, traditional companies now. And for example, if I talk to Ilya and I say, hey, let's do an event. Okay. You're like, yeah, we'll do something. But these other companies, I message them and then I get a very formal message back. And then it goes to them and they say, well, we're considering it. We need to talk to the proper people and determine this. So there's definitely that chain of command and a little bit more overhead bureaucracy, for lack of a better term.
And maybe even some paperwork.
And maybe some paper. Yes, there is paperwork that I've had to do. Yes. You didn't make me do paperwork. Thank you.
Yeah, there is a lot on this point about corporate partners. First, I'll start from how I see the ecosystem here, the startup and venture and so on. I first came to Japan, moved here in 2020, and since then, it's always been just on the rise, right? I haven't experienced before, and I know a lot of people burnt out of being 15 years in Japan trying to build here, because, well, it's still hard, right? But if you look at this in the past 4 years, there's more funding, there are more people. So I've always seen as a positive trend where this ecosystem is going. Obviously, there are still lots of difficulties, like finding the talent. There's a shortage of 50% of machine learning talent, for instance. For every 2 positions, you can only find 1 person, right? At the same time, it's very hard to attract this talent because salaries are still low, even though increasing. Equity valuation is still low. How do you attract early engineers? If there is not enough capital, how do you promise them that equity? Like the one example, Palantir, when they were a smaller company out of San Francisco, they were paying up below market, right? But there was this dream that you can make some more on the equity side, but you also can build something cool. Here, very hard apart, some companies in the AI space, robotics and space. So it's a very positive trend. Difficulties that I see, and I've seen them already 4 years ago or 5 years ago, and I'm still seeing them. And it's pretty obvious here, like where are the Japanese? I find it very difficult. We have 2,000 people in my community, only 35% are Japanese. There's definitely a language barrier, but we have also some events that are in Japanese. Even if I don't speak any, we still have somebody who helps in Japanese, right? And it's just a different culture. To cover a similar example to you, we organized one for the Japanese startuppers and one for international startuppers. After the international one, everybody stays, just talks, have drinks. After the Japanese one, half leaves right away. No questions, nothing. It's improving, so we were trying to make this trick where we create 2 separate communities, and without telling them, we merge them. So, slowly. So, yeah, and when the corporate partner is super tough, I think there is a good strategy. You just get them to come to your events. For instance, we didn't have any big companies knowing about us, and then we invited Panasonic and Syngenta, for instance, 2 big conglomerates, right? And they came, and now Sompo reached out because they want to present something. Toyota Tsusho, right? Fujitsu. So it's really show them a little bit of this value, get them in somehow. And it just took a year, so, but still possible. Right?
So you're saying that peer pressure works, almost like FOMO for companies, where if you show that there's an established, the risk is less. So traditional Japanese companies, very risk averse. If you show that the risk is less by other companies are doing it, the dominoes may fall.
Right, and it requires some tricks, right? Once you organize an event at JETRO and somehow you're sponsored by JETRO, right? It gives you a lot of credibility and so on and so forth. Then initially these are tricks and then they come. So it's like this, I don't like the term, it's a fake it till you make it kind of strategy. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Interesting. So, okay, as a community manager, are you looking for sponsor to help your organization currently?
So, yes, kind of passively, not actively. Our community, especially compared to Ilya's, I feel like is still growing. And we've been extremely blessed that just when we started out, somehow I connected with Urishihara-san, Takuo-san, and they offered me to, present here, have an event here. So we've been absolutely blessed to be able to do events here and not really need the funding, because we've sort of been able to merge with Thursday Gathering. So we've had an automatic venue, automatic audience, automatic audio-visual stuff. and refreshments. I think as we grow, we will probably want to explore other places as well. For example, we're talking here and there with Tokyo Innovation Base as one location, and maybe Lewagen also, Sasha, I've spoken to. So if we do events at other places, yes, we definitely want to have corporate sponsors for things like refreshments, and even just offering up the space would be great. And of course, what we could bring is a whole bunch of robotics interest and talent, international. And yeah, if you're interested, for sure, reach out to me. It's not something that we're actively after, especially because I am so busy, and like there's only a few of us managing it. Also, if you want to help out with the organizing, please get in touch with me for sure. But yeah.
A question. So we were talking about this growing ecosystem and startups and so on. A trend I've noticed in the past year, since I came back, there are more and more international foreign entrepreneurs after exits or after the MBAs and so on, moving here to start in Japan. And they're not just weebs, right? Not just nerds. They want to be based here for operational cost arbitrage, for obviously lifestyle and infrastructure availability. And almost every week I'm meeting 2-3 new founders that are trying to move here, and sometimes manage to match them with some of these other founders. But have you noticed this trend as well? People coming to you and really trying to show that they want to build here? There are obviously huge difficulties in doing that from the Japanese side, but have you seen this trend yourself as well? Maybe you too?
Yeah, I have. But I'm wondering why, when the yen is so weak compared to the dollar, does it make sense for them to come here when they could be building something? Maybe it's offset by the fact that maybe it's easier to get funding here. I don't know the reason.
You raise in US dollars, you spend it.
That is true, and then it's like monopoly money when you come over here. But
So like you're talking about the trends of the inbound of those entrepreneurs. Yeah, well, first of all, like we have to, we can't generalize all those like inbound trends like from outside of Japan. For example, if you look at the East Asia, like Taiwan, Korea, we sense there is a more and more growing number or interest of those like startups about to Japan's market. And if you look at the population of Korea, it's less than 60 million population, and then Taiwan is less than 30 million population. And then now things are crazy all in the world. But if you look at Japan, the country risk is very low. If you look at the societal side of Japan, very stable. So relatively, comparably, Japan's being very attractive market for Korean and Taiwanese startups, and the cultural difference is very small. From all those like a Western country, the startups from Western countries or the other regions, right? And the other side is cultural asset is very strong in Japan. If you look at the quality of life, I know like if you work for a Japanese corporation, it's so bad. But like otherwise, like if you like how'd you say, the living costs, the quality of food or those like infrastructure, they are very good in Japan. So I guess like they are making like Japan a sort of appealing destination. And then one more thing that I can mention is maybe cultural asset that Japan has. For example, anime or those like subculture stuff is actually making also Japan is very attractive, So maybe Japan is not a super the best destination for business or starting venture or startup, right? But like still like desirable place, I guess. That's maybe that could explain maybe that trend. I think, yeah.
Maybe something you mentioned earlier as well, in terms of labor shortage, right? For every AI or robotics job, there's actually, there's one for two. And that might be an interesting trend as well, where we're seeing recruitment having a much stronger presence. I find stronger presence here in Japan than maybe in Silicon Valley or even in Canada or Europe, is that matching up the engineers with the jobs has, and in my experience as well, always going through recruitment. And maybe that's where there's an opportunity to see, you come here to Japan, you get the workers from, let's say, Silicon Valley at a discount, and you're doing the same work. That's possibly one of the benefits of coming and making your startup here. And yeah, I definitely agree. Like the cultural aspect, I think, is very attractive in that sense. But at some point, if you get stuck in like this Japanese style working, then of course you want to move on. And having maybe like foreign startup in Japan, you won't have that same working subculture. I think that's something that might be interesting. And then you have people who do want to stay or who don't want to go to the other startup because they know, their culture is more black.
But like, can I share the?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, like some introduction. So now, ecosystem is a really trending term all around the world. And then I just wanted to share some document that I created because almost every week we accept a delegation of startups or students, from all around the world, and then I have an opportunity to present about the current status of Tokyo's ecosystem. So I just wanted to share some fundamental information around the startup ecosystem of Japan. So Japan's innovation ecosystem overview is something like this. So fortunately, every year, organization called Startup Genome, they publish the ranking of these like a startup ecosystem, and then Tokyo is ranked actually 10th last year, 2024. And then, so like meaning Tokyo is performing pretty well. Then like tier 1, tier 2 cities like, Silicon Valley, New York, London, Tel Aviv, LA, Boston, these guys are always the same. But tier 3 cities are like somewhat kind of ups and downs, changing, fluctuating. But in general, Asian cities are following all those like 6 cities on top, in the tier 1 and tier 2, and then followed by those like European cities. So this is a sort of a current situation, status, what's happening, or the ranking of ecosystem all around the world. And Tokyo is doing great. And then if you take a more close look about the performance of Tokyo. So basically, the methodology that the startup genome created is based on these like 5 categories: performance, funding, talent, and experience, and market research knowledge, right? So these are the more like how to say the detailed information or explanation about those like categories, right? And then basically talent and experience, market reach, and knowledge are the measurement about the very fundamental business capability. As you can see, Japan's got now the 3rd largest GDP. Of course, Japan's got a very strong foundation for business. So Tokyo's got a very strong score for those 3 categories. But actually, Tokyo is lagging behind in the category of performance and funding. And these categories are actually indicators for the actual startup ecosystem. performance. So meaning Tokyo's been still in very immature stage compared to these like cities like Silicon Valley, Boston, or New York or London. So with that, so I just wanted to share this like a very fundamental information, and then like in association with robotics or AI, actually Japan government, Tokyo's government wanting to kind of really improve this situation, and particularly deep tech, AI, including robotics are the focal point of to emphasize. And then actually now the government's budget has been, always like, it's getting bigger every year. And then actually rushing, like those money floating into those like universities or research institutes. So obviously like maybe these communities are kind of addressing the the really important points for Japan. But on the other hand, one more thing, like on the other hand, Japan or Tokyo has been kind of needs more improvement, particularly to engage or involve global talents. So as you said, the cultural asset is great, and then many people come around. But I see other trend that those global talents leave Japan after about like a few years, right? 5 years, 6 years. So Japan's being like failing to kind of keep those like wonderful global talents reside in Japan like more longer term, right? So that's just because maybe Japan's or Tokyo's ecosystem has been still very immature stage. We just still need to improve to learn how to kind of accommodate, how to live together, how to leverage all those global talents, to create the impact to the society. So that's I just wanted to share that.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.